Hello, everybody. Welcome. We're so glad to have you with us here tonight and to welcome you to this Latino Leader Gathering on climate change, environmental justice, and Latino priorities, hearing the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor. My name is Kim Daniels, and I am the director of the Initiative on Catholic Social Thought and Public Life at Georgetown University. We are grateful to have Bishop Avelio Amenabar here today at the School of Continuing Studies to introduce tonight's dialogue. Bishop Avelio is an auxiliary bishop of the Roman Catholic Archdiocese of Washington and serves as an advisor to our Latino Leader program, and we're very grateful for that. He migrated to the United States in 1990 and has served as a priest of the Archdiocese of Washington since his ordination in 2004. Thank you for being with us, Bishop Avelio.
Very happy to be here with you tonight talking or introducing actually this wonderful topic that we have today. And I was just thinking, what about if we start reading the Bible, sacred scripture, through the lenses of ecology, the care of creation, and then we will find out that from the beginning to the end of our wonderful history of salvation, the care of creation is there. The theme of ecology is there. Since God created the earth until the great renewal of everything in Christ and through Christ, there is nature, earth, and everything that earth contains, including, of course, we humans. But as I was thinking about what to talk about, how to introduce this theme, I came across a passage of the Bible, very kind of unthinkable that you can find something about ecology in the book of Jonah, Prophet Jonah. At the almost at the very end, there is a passage that says, "Then the Lord God provided a vine and made grow up over Jonah to give shade for his head, to ease his discomfort. And Jonah was very happy about the vine. But at dawn the next day, God provided a worm, which shook the vine so that it withered. When the sun rose, God provided a scorching east wind." Imagine how hot that was. "And the sun blazed on Jonah's head so that he grew faint. He wanted to die and said, it would be better for me to die than to live." I think this is the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor. When we see how the natural resources, in a way, the beautiful earth that the Lord has created just withers and dies right on our faces. Laudato Si, Pope Francis' encyclical letter on care of our common home begins with these beautiful words. Laudato Si, mi Signore. Praise to you, my Lord. In the words of this beautiful canticle, St. Francis of Assisi reminds us that our common home is like a sister with whom we share our life, and a beautiful mother who opens her arms to embrace us. Praise to you, my Lord, through our sister, Mother Earth, who sustains and governs us, and who produces various fruit with colorful flowers and herbs. This sister now cries out to us because of the harm we have inflicted on her by our irresponsible use and abuse of the goods with which God has endowed her. We have come to see ourselves as her lords and masters, entitled to plunder her at will. The violence present in our hearts, wounded by sin, is also reflected in the symptoms of sickness, evident in the soil, in the water, in the air, and in all forms of life. This is why the earth herself, burdened and laid waste, is among the most abandoned and maltreated of our poor. She groans in travail. We have forgotten that we ourselves are dust of the earth. Our very bodies are made up of her elements. We breathe her air, and we receive life and refreshment from her waters. So Pope Francis urgently appeals to all of us, whether we are believers or not. He appeals for a new awareness and a dialogue about how we are shaping the future of our planet. He says we need a conversation which includes everyone, since the environmental challenge we are undergoing and its human roots concern and affects all of us. So a true ecology approach always becomes a social approach. It must integrate questions of justice in debates and on the environment, so as to hear both the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor, because everything is connected, the Holy Father says. So I'm very looking forward to hear our panelists talk about this wonderful theme. So God bless you.
Thank you, Bishop Evelio, for those words, for your support of our initiative, and especially these Latino leader gatherings, and of course for your leadership in the church. Bishop Evelio gave the commencement address last Saturday to graduates of Georgetown's College of Arts and Sciences, and it was absolutely tremendous. He got a standing ovation. It had been raining all day, and I kid you not, the rain stopped for 20 minutes for his speech. Welcome to everyone who's joined us here today, both those of you who are here at Georgetown and the hundreds who have joined us here online. I'm Christian Sunan, the projects manager of the Initiative on Catholic Social Thought and Public Life here at Georgetown. Those online can join the conversation using the hashtag LatinoEcoJusticeGU, and we'll have an opportunity for questions from our in-person audience at the end of the dialogue. This dialogue is also being recorded, and we'll post it on our website and social media channels for later viewing. In his commencement address, Bishop Evelio reminded us that the way that we treat the vulnerable in our society is the indicator of whether we are or are not a great nation. Some of the most important vulnerabilities are also the most difficult to understand because they're widely shared. They're caused by collective decisions, and they require collective action. Environmental degradation threatens whole communities, but it especially threatens the poor and the vulnerable. This is why 9 years ago, as Bishop Evelio said, Pope Francis said in Laudato Si that a true ecological approach must integrate questions of justice in debates on the environment to hear both the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor. Social injustice is compounded by environmental destruction. This is one reason why Latino communities in the United States, who already experience a number of social inequities, are among those most affected and most concerned about the costs of climate change. In his recent interview for CBS News with Nora O'Donnell, who is a Georgetown alumna and also spoke at Georgetown's commencement ceremonies this past weekend, Pope Francis said that protecting the planet is the most pressing issue of our day. The earth is the future, he said. It is life. Today, we'll discuss how Latino communities in the U.S. experience environmental crises, how they're responding, and the role of the Catholic community. We have 4 impressive leaders who are here to talk about exactly this. Sylvia Foster-Frau is a national investigative reporter at the Washington Post who explores how local, state, and federal governments serve our country's diversifying population, as well as the effects of America's changing demographics. Sylvia also was recently awarded the Pulitzer Prize, along with others at the Post, for their exceptional reporting on the AR-15 and the destruction it's caused in mass killings in the United States. Thank you, Sylvia, for your work, and also congratulations on this well-deserved recognition of it.
Thank you.
Elena Gauna is the Chispa Communications Director at the League of Conservation Voters. She's held communications roles at other nonprofits and governmental agencies, including the Catholic Climate Covenant, Unidos US, the Center for American Progress, the National Association of Hispanic Journalists, and the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. Mark Hugo Lopez is the Director of Race and Ethnicity Research at Pew Research Center. He's an expert on Latino politics and culture, global and domestic immigration, and the U.S. demographic landscape. And finally, Bishop Joseph Tyson, who's joining us live and online from Yakima, Washington, where he serves as bishop. He's the Episcopal Liaison for the Catholic Climate Covenant and is the chair of the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops Subcommittee on Pastoral Care for Migrants, Refugees, and Travelers. So to get us started, we'll start with a question for all of you. We'll start with you, Mark. Why are environmental issues particularly important to Latino communities in the United States, especially now?
So our surveys of Latino adults over the years have shown that they're more likely to be concerned about environmental issues than other Americans, and particularly because they say these are impacting their communities. So 3/4 of Latino adults say that their communities are impacted at least some by environmental issues. What are those issues? Well, they're really local issues in many ways. It's about air pollution. It's about water pollution. 70% of Latino adults point to those as being issues in their local communities. Too many landfills or too much trash. It's also something that more than 70% cite as an issue. And what's striking here is that Latinos are more likely to say that their communities are being impacted by this than other Americans. In fact, much more so, with immigrant Latinos most likely and younger Latinos most likely to say this, along with Democrats as well. You've asked about some of the other issues, and I think it's important to think about where do Latinos place climate change as a policy priority for both the Congress and president to address. And you'll see that about 61% of Latinos say addressing climate change is something that should be done by the president and Congress. It's a top priority, more so than the general public, but it's not the top priority that they would put before Congress this year. In fact, the economy, the job market, inflation actually rate much higher as issues for Latinos than climate change or addressing global climate change. That, I think, is both very interesting and important. So the story is one of a lot of concern, more so than the general public, a lot of local impacts on a whole range of issues, but other issues nationally might be placed higher for Latino families and Latino adults than, say, issues like climate change.
Great. Sylvia, on to you. Why are environmental issues of particular importance to U.S. Latinos, especially now?
Yeah, I was thinking about that question, and I think one of the best examples is actually in my own family. My family is from Puerto Rico, and my grandfather weathered Hurricane Maria, which hit the island in 2017. And so there you had an example, one of changing weather patterns and climate change. Hurricanes in particular, right, affect very Latino areas, both in the US mainland and obviously in Puerto Rico. And then on the back end of that, my grandfather, who has now passed away, there were 6 months where his home had no electricity. So then on the other hand, you have the question of how much is our government willing to invest in Latino communities and in Latino issues, right? In Puerto Rico, they really struggled to get infrastructure back into those communities. I mean, imagine being a 90-something-year-old man spending with 6 months without electricity. Luckily, long story short, like he was not in the island at the time, but my uncle was traveling with a machete just to go get like FEMA rations forever. I mean, so those kinds of stories, right, are happening in communities across the country. And I think looking at both kind of the environmental effects on the communities and also our government's response, especially when it happens in predominantly Latino communities and Black communities and Asian American communities is really important and relevant now, especially ahead of the election where Latinos, who I think they said like 4 million more Latinos will be eligible to vote this year, will be weighing in on who those elected officials are that control that kind of funding for their communities.
Elena, same question to you. Why are environmental issues of particular importance to U.S. Latino communities?
Yeah, I think for a lot of our communities, it's literally a matter of life and death. And while climate change is here, it has been here longer and felt more deeply by communities that are Latino in the U.S. And when I think about like some of the states we work in right now dealing with extreme heat, and then not being able to afford the high cost of getting out of that heat, and then because our society needs more air conditioning or more travel, then we need more oil. And where are those refineries put? They're put in our neighborhoods and communities that are not always able to stop the refineries from coming, or LNG processing plants, or what is it, like ammonia, green ammonia. So it's like circular. And so these effects are just felt deeply longer and at every stage of our lives.
Bishop Tyson, same question to you. Why are environmental issues of particular importance to U.S. Latinos?
Yeah, thanks. See, it's a great opportunity to dialogue, so thank you. I'm bishop of the diocese where I was born, and I'm bishop in the cathedral where I was baptized. So we spoke German with our grandparents, English on the streets, and Spanish in the field. So those are my three languages. It's my home. But we're also home to a large Hispanic community that goes back to the Second World War, when when we sent an army to Europe, Mexico sent an army of harvesters going back to the Bracero laws. We're about 75% Hispanic across the diocese. Most people go to Mass in Spanish. It's largely agriculture. A large part of my diocese is undocumented people, and they're very vulnerable, working in the fields, taking in the smoke from the forest fires, exposure to pesticides, and then labor practices that are not always fair. It's a blessed place, but in terms of particularly the environment and the conditions in which our people work in the fields can be very, very hazardous. So that's why it's kind of core here that we're looking at this here in the Diocese of Yakima.
Well, Mark, let's turn back to you now and give us a little bit more of a kind of a broad overview of what we're talking about here. You're the Director of Race and Ethnicity Research at Pew. You're a researcher. You're not here as an advocate or a policymaker. And you and Pew are the sources of some of the best data that we have on U.S. Latino political attitudes, opinions, and demographics, including this leading study on Latinos' views of climate change and environmental issues. So how do U.S. Latinos relate to and think about environmental issues, especially climate change? What do the data tell us? And what are some of the most important trends and findings from your research?
So as I was saying earlier, a lot of it is local. It's the impacts that people are seeing in their local communities around air pollution, water pollution, around garbage and trash in their neighborhoods. But I'd also say that Latinos are more likely than the general public. So like about 2/3 of Latinos will say that climate change is being caused by human activity. That's something that they're more likely to say than the general U.S. public. Interestingly, among Latinos, as I mentioned, immigrants are more likely to see climate change as a challenge for both the nation, the world, but also their communities than U.S.-born Latinos. But interestingly, Republican Latinos and Latino Democrats have different and opposing points of view on just about every single issue around climate or around anything having to do with environment and environmental policy. That, in many ways, is just like the general U.S. public. Republicans are less supportive and less of the view that climate change is actually happening. Democrat Latinos are more likely to say that that is the case or something that is occurring. Finally, I want to say that many Latino Catholics hold pretty strong views about the importance of the earth and how it is important to protect the earth, just like many other Catholics do and just like many other religious Americans do. And interestingly, 3/4 of Latinos who are religiously active tell us that they hear about climate activism in their sermons where they go to church. That is really interesting. Now, not everybody is Catholic. That's not all Catholic. That includes people who are non-Catholic as well. But that's much higher, almost double what we see for other Americans who are religiously active and yet are not hearing messages about climate activism in the sermons from their churches.
Okay. And how does that relate to let's say other ethnic groups? How do Latinos? You talked a little bit about it being, their opinions are similar to those of the broader population.
On some things, yeah.
Are there certain places where they might differ, or certain places where you see the attitudes being particularly kind of tied to the Latino population?
Again, it comes back to when it comes to what's happening in their local communities. Latinos are more concerned about environmental degradation that's happening in their communities than the general U.S. public. And that's a pattern that's true across all different kinds of environmental degradation you might see in a local community. But that hyper awareness and hyper engagement about what's happening in their local communities is something that seems to distinguish the Latino population from Black, Asian, and white Americans in our surveys. And I think that's really interesting. That's quite striking. And also on the top priorities for Congress to address, Latinos are more likely than whites, blacks, or Asians to say addressing climate change should be a top priority for the president and Congress. Even if it isn't a top priority overall for them, they're more likely to rate it higher in an issue list than, say, white, black, or Asian Americans.
Great. So Mark was just telling us about how U.S. Latinos see a lot of these issues as local issues. You've obviously covered a lot of this. You're one of the most informed and respected journalists on changing racial and ethnic demographics in the United States, and we're very happy to have you with us. One of your more recent stories was about the water crisis in Sunland Park, New Mexico, where the water was contaminated with dangerous levels of arsenic that led to health issues for much of the predominantly Latino population. Can you tell us a little bit about what happened in Sunland Park, both now and I understand there were some issues with environmental degradation in the past, and what are the larger implications of this story for the way that Latinos live throughout the United States?
Yeah, so I did a story out of Sunland Park, New Mexico, which is a small community on the border with Mexico and Texas. It's kind of right near El Paso. And their story started, I came to find out when I went down there and I got to know some of the activists and residents who had been there a long time, that the city's story of kind of environmental fights and justice began back in the 1980s, like soon after they were incorporated as a city, where there was a landfill and an incinerator over their water source. And a group of folks called Concerned Citizens of Sunland Park all banded together and basically advocated really hard to remove the incinerator and also to deny a permit for the landfill that was above their water. They were seeing all sorts of strange things. There were I saw old newspaper clippings of images of worms coming out of their tap because there were holes in some of the water tanks. There were reports of babies being born with like partial or no brains, like very absurd things going on in this community. And they advocated really hard, and they got some folks who flew in, and they ended up being able to remove the incinerator from that town. Fast forward to now, I'm an investigative reporter, and I was looking into the issue of water. This year marks 50 years since the passage of the Safe Drinking Water Act. And so the kind of question was, how are we now after this kind of like landmark ruling that was supposed to ensure safe drinking water for all communities and everyone across the country? And what I found was that in Sunland Park, after requesting some records and meeting folks down there, had for at least 16 years reported illegally high levels of arsenic in their drinking water. And people were talking about a host of health problems. I met families that had a lot of family members who were struggling with cancer or who had died from cancer. Diabetes is very prevalent, skin lesions, hair loss. One of the interesting things about this phenomenon is that environmental issues disproportionately affect low-income communities, right? And a lot of times, low-income communities also have disproportionately high rates of a lot of these illnesses and conditions. And so it's also very hard in those situations for those communities and those lawyers and activists to prove that these kind of long-term conditions and diseases are exacerbated by this particular environmental factor. In this case, it was arsenic. And so they really struggled to kind of even build a case and make that connection. And there's not a lot of great science yet able to do that kind of thing. But basically, over the course of my investigation, some of the residents, it was really the older folks who remembered back in the 80s what it was like, kind of having to do that fight, that tried to basically revive that same momentum and energy. And they faced a lot of barriers. It's like an 85% Spanish-speaking community. And a lot of the government notices and meetings were in English, and so there was a very big language divide and civic engagement issues and kind of a host of barriers that made it really difficult for them to kind of raise their voice. But I can kind of wrap it up by saying, at least for now, since my reporting, the state of New Mexico has been launching probes and investigations into that water utility to try to figure out what was going on. Another kind of element to this story is that arsenic is actually naturally occurring in the rock in those areas and in lots of parts of New Mexico. So it really is incumbent on the government to make sure that there's arsenic treatment plants that are up and running and working constantly to keep the drinking water safe. And so this was clearly not an example. This wasn't a natural phenomenon that was suddenly occurring or suddenly started 16 years ago. This is like a long-standing element that had been there, that there's treatment facilities there in the city, and the government just wasn't keeping on top of making sure that that water was clean. And so, Sunland Park can be used as an example, both of like kind of the struggles to fighting that kind of issue. I think it can be an example too of, the role that government plays in environmental issues. And it also, some of my reporting kind of got into these EPA standards for contaminants and toxins in all sorts of elements, including water, and how those standards are kind of crafted both in the interest of public health, but also in the interest of the cost it would be to the utility to regulate it, and also at the technology available at the time. And so, I kind of used Sunland Park and their story, both obviously to kind of shed light on what was going on there, but also to show it as an example of these bigger issues.
So you talked about legal barriers, you talked about language barriers, you started talking about political challenges. Let's talk a little bit more about the political challenges. Another story you wrote back in December focused on Dodge City, Kansas, a city whose population is primarily Latino, but whose city council is almost nearly all white. How does that come about? How do those disparities in representation come about? And what do they mean for the way that governments, local, state, or national, are able to respond to crises like the one that we saw in Sunland Park?
Yeah, so Dodge City is kind of a famed old Western town. It's the site of a lot of kind of old Westerns, and it's kind of seen in the public imagination as like a classic kind of white American Western, right, with cowboys. And it's funny, when I went there driving down, like they still have a lot of that symbolism everywhere in the town. But that city is actually 65% Latino now. And that's in large part due to the meatpacking plants that are in that corner of Kansas. And what I found there basically was the government structure. They don't use single member districts. They use basically a form of city council election where everyone in the town gets to elect everyone on the board. And what a lot of kind of experts in elections and voting rights have found is that single member districts, so districts where you're representing a neighborhood in a city and then another council member is representing another neighbor, often leads to more equitable elections. And so we kind of decided to focus on Dodge City because in all of these conversations about voting rights and elections and redistricting at the congressional level, there's also this kind of tool or system at the very local level, like the level of that really controls your everyday, your schools, your roads, that kind of thing. That is very much, depending on what kind of election structure you have at the local level, can very much determine the representation you have on the board. And as we all know, this is another example of a more recent immigrant community so there is a language barrier there and other things where it can be very helpful to have people who look like you and are from your background running the city.
So let's talk a little bit more about those local efforts, and that's a perfect time to turn to you now, Elena. You support the League of Conservation Voters as part of CHISPA, which is an effort to organize and mobilize Latino communities that are facing environmental issues. Sylvia told us about one community facing a toxic water crisis, but we know that these kinds of environmental crises threaten low-income communities and communities of color around the United States. How can we begin to understand and respond to these twin economic and environmental crises, what Pope Francis has called the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor, and improve these situations of disparity? And also, what does the Catholic faith provide for us in terms of understanding and addressing these linked crises?
Thank you, Christian. Yeah, I wanted to, that makes me think of taking it way back to CCD, which I think is, I hope it's still called CCD, Sunday School. And, and I remember in second grade, one of the biggest lessons I got from our teacher was we were learning about the 10 Commandments. It was, thou shalt not kill, no matarás. And I remember the teacher standing up and saying, matar no es solo boom, boom, boom. You know, killing is not just boom, boom, boom. You also have the ability to kill people's spirit and people's soul, and that is what the commandments also talk about. So I've really grown up with this lesson my whole life of trying not to harm other people's spirit and soul, and seeing that as part of living my Catholic faith. So it's interesting to me that now with Chispa, we work with communities in Texas, Arizona, Nevada, Colorado, Maryland, at times in other states like New Mexico, New York. And we do work with partner orgs, and some of our events are very focused on recreation and fishing and hiking. So it's not to say that that's not part of our work as well. But I think the origin story that I hear from our staff and our leaders and our community organizers is more urgent and is more like, my child can't breathe. We don't have safe drinking water. We can't afford energy prices. I didn't come to retire to this community to have a refinery next to me. So what makes our community become environmentalist is, you know, with the community organizers we work, is more urgent and more connected to life and death of their children and of themselves and of their neighbors. And so this made me think of how, I'm sorry. What was the second part of the question?
What does the Catholic faith provide in terms of our understanding of these issues?
Oh yeah, so the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor has a very physical connection. Sorry, I lost my train of thought. And how people are like literally, their physical environment is harming them. And so that is the cry of the earth connected to their bodies. But also the cry of the poor is that, going back to that issue of thou shalt not kill, how people, spirits and souls are harmed because they, like everyone, wants to live in a community that they can be proud of. And yet they know in their hearts and in their souls that not everybody has to deal with not having safe drinking water. Not everybody has to go out and buy water every day. Not everybody has to go outside of their home to a cooling center because their home is not livable. And so that goes to hearing the cry of the earth and the poor very viscerally connected to the idea, the Catholic idea of human life and dignity of every person. And so that's where, when we hear both as citizens or as people of this earth or as people of faith, we're hearing those connected.
So let's talk a little bit more about what you've seen in the communities that you work with, the ways that they've tried to address these issues. What needs to occur on the local level? What are some things that you've seen that have worked well? And what needs to occur on the national level to address these issues? How can communities of faith and others respond to make a difference?
Yeah, locally, I think, Sylvia, you talked about like Spanish-speaking communities becoming, like advocating for themselves. And locally, I'm just continually impressed by lots of moms and lots of dads who may not even speak English, but organize with their neighbors. And in Maryland and in other states, one of our biggest campaigns has been clean buses for healthy niños. And it's changing diesel buses into electric run buses, because children, when they stand there, like in Maryland, our organizer once said, every family we talk to, basically their children have asthma. And so when they change the bus to an electric bus, it's cleaner, it's safer, their children can breathe, And the mom told me, like, my child can breathe now. And she was one of the activists. And I see her, and she's just amazing. It's like your lady, if you grew up in a Latino community, who sells Avon, right? And she's, instead of selling Avon, she's doing getting more and more organizers to then bring more and more organizers. So at the local level, that's what it takes. It's like, what's in front of me? How do I organize? And they become such leaders. They go meet with their elected officials, and they don't have all these talking points. They literally are sharing their story and changing laws. And so when we become civically engaged like that, they're not just voting, they are speaking up, organizing, attending meetings, signing petitions, sometimes running for office. And so that's what it takes. And I think, like, in Colorado, one of our big issues is safe drinking water. There are a lot of, like, 1/5 of the community, Latino community in Colorado, according to our organizers, live in mobile homes where they don't have clean water. And that's not an issue that anyone was helping them with. And now they're organizing around that. And like Nevada and Arizona, they're working a lot on heat islands. And what we can do right now is we have the biggest opportunity under IRA, the Affordable Clean Energy Plan, to get grants to green your community, grants to make your home solar, grants to get, or rebates and tax credits to get electric vehicles. All of this leads to green jobs. Like, I don't know if people know, but like almost 1/5 of clean energy jobs are taken by Latino workers, and that's making their families like have a decent living. So right now, right here, we have like a historic opportunity. And so what we're doing with our organizers is for them to know about this and let their community know about this so that they can get, like, trees. What Father Evelio was talking about, the story of Jonah, and trees, like literally trees can make your community healthier. And so that's basically it right now. I feel like I had something else to say that I can't remember that. So, but the IRA is the biggest thing right now.
Well, Bishop Tyson, I know in your diocese there's a lot of these kinds of efforts going on. You serve the Diocese of Yakima, Washington, which has a large Hispanic population, especially a large immigrant farm worker population, and an economy that relies very heavily on agriculture. You're also a preeminent leader among the bishops on climate issues. Why have you chosen to focus your ministry on these aspects of your diocese? And how is all of this connected? In your diocese, how do immigration, farm labor, and environmental justice come together in the communities that you serve? And how does it shape the life of the church in your diocese?
Yeah, well, that's a big question. Thank you. I wouldn't necessarily, I'm preeminent. I'm from Yakima. I'm a bit of a backbencher. People want to know where Yakima is, and I tell them it's the center of the universe and a carefully guarded secret. But with that said, let me just kind of anchor this in a story. I mean, no labor, no immigrants, there is no food on your table. It's that simple. Without immigration and our farm labor, you wouldn't have any apples or cherries. I mean, how does this pull together? Let me just kind of anchor this in a story. During, you probably heard about the big heat dome that we see in the Pacific Northwest. We literally, there's a town, Bridgeport. We have no masses there in English. Most of the folks have immigrated from, in that part, are mainly from towns and villages in the state of Guerrero. And many would be working on, false documents. They would be undocumented. Literally, the entire town was surrounded by fire. And this is not forest fire. That's another story. We have that going on right now. But then, literally, the earth was drying out. And the entire, so these were field fires that had surrounded the town. 15 of our parishioners needed to relocate. I mean, this is climate change forcing migrants to migrate. And of course, harvest is going on. So, people are in the heat. They're breathing the smoke. You might have heard about Lillooet First Nation in And British Shore is about halfway between Yakima and Penticton, British Columbia. Lillooet exploded in flames, and the entire town was incinerated. It reached 40 degrees. It was a record, 40 degrees centigrade, a record in terms of incineration. Well, we're all, breathing that smoke and picking cherries. Cherries need to be picked in the morning because the sugar recedes back into the tree when the heat hits. So these are multiple factors that impact the life of our people. In a couple of weeks, I require the seminarians to pick fruit in the summer, because if you want to elevate the bread and wine, the gift of the earth, the work of human hands, I want my men who are future priests to know the labor that goes in to put the cherries into the basket. My mom's first cousin, one of my cousins, was a cherry farmer. He died during COVID in his 80s. But this is our life. No farm labor, no care for the environment. We will not be able to eat. I don't use the word climate change a lot in English. I tend to use the word growing season, and I try to get people to think through, especially our older Anglophone farmers. Tell me when cherries came in 40 years ago, and they'll say, oh, about 4th of July. When are they coming in now? June. I mean, I'm looking for ways to wedge this climate crisis open that are graspable for everybody, both the Anglophone community as well as the majority Spanish-speaking community in the diocese. So those are just a couple of items I would just put on the table.
Most people think that my ethical sense comes from Catholic social teaching, but it actually comes from Latin American hip hop. There's a rapper from Chile, Luanco, who has this beautiful line in one of his songs where he says, "No te olvides que debajo del concreto está la tierra, más que bella todos los que comen bien en ella." Don't forget that under the concrete is the land, more than beautiful, all the people that are nourished by it. And he's part of an indigenous group in Chile, the Mapuche. And I met a priest from Chile who told me that whenever he ministered to the Mapuche, the penitential rite at the Mass included turning to every cardinal direction and apologizing to the land. There's a deep spirituality in exactly what you're saying, Bishop Tyson, this connection to the land that nourishes us. And so to talk a little bit more about that spirituality, 9 years ago this week, Pope Francis released his powerful encyclical Laudato Si. How has that letter changed you and your people, and how should it challenge the Church in the United States as we face the crucial choices on climate change and other environmental issues?
Well, just a couple of things, and I hope this is making sense. Laudato Si is the centerpiece of a triptych that includes Tutti Fratelli, because there's a big section in Laudato Si about people and an integral human ecology, and Laudate Deum. So we shouldn't estimate the fact that each one of these is a direct quote from St. Francis. I mean, Laudato Si reads like a graduate course seminar when you really get into the economics and the interplay of how things are interconnected economically, socially, spiritually, and humanly. But it's grounded in a spiritual vision of St. Francis. The titles are directly from the writings of Francis, the Canticle, as well as his rule of life. And in many ways, I would invite people to see Laudato Si as one long Lectio Divina. It's one long meditation, prayerful about our praise of God, our treatment of the environment, and how well we're doing that. So I think that is key, because this is about living the life of conversion. I mean, I want us to be elbow and knee with the people in the fields, So we know in our bones, you know, what the effects of climate change and the climate crisis are doing to our people. I mean, I love the opening prayer from the bishop because, in a certain way, I'm oversimplifying this, but you know, in sacred scripture in the Old Testament, the land sealed the covenant between God and the people. And when the land was treated well, people would flourish, and the covenant was kept. And when we were not just to people or just to the land, the covenant was broken. And so this is about a spirituality of renewal, of us really treating with dignity the human person and all they do and all we do and we are in the land, in the earth. So this is the call to conversion and to an openness of heart and an accompaniment. I want to say one more thing, and I hope I'm not over talking. You know, since we're all kind of flipping a little bit into Spanish, even though this is in English. The one thing one word, you know, I was rereading this today. In Spanish, in English, you know, you read in Laudato Si, Pope Francis decrying the throwaway culture. But, you know, in Spanish, and you know this better than I do, the term in Laudato Si in Spanish is descartados. In other words, it's like we treat people like packaging, and we just discard the packaging and grab the product. It's a deeply narcissistic, twist. I mean, Pope Francis can be very creative, and he doesn't necessarily use our northern category, fachas, chanclas, cachucha, things from Aztec words, but he's got these Italian twists in his Argentinian Spanish. But descartados, it's very strong. It's more than throwaway. It is just discarding people in order to grab the what we want from the earth and the product we want. This is a deep call to conversion, and it's very hard to preach and put that in front of people at times. I guess I'm grateful. We spend a lot of time on Aquí Allá. We do public affairs programming with others on the Radio Cadena, La Voz del Campesino, here in Yakima. And we do try to provide opportunities, especially in Spanish, for people's voices to be heard. I should stop there because I think I'm talking too much, but thanks for the question.
Well, I'm interested in what you said, Bishop Tyson, about these immigrant populations, and I know, Mark, you've done some work that kind of talks about, first generation, second generation Latinos and how their opinions differ. Can you talk a little bit about that? What is it that we see there? How do ties, the closeness of a person's ties to Latin America affect the way that they respond to these surveys?
Yes, it's actually quite striking. As I mentioned earlier, immigrant Latinos, more likely than native-born, U.S.-born Latinos, say climate change is an important issue the country should address. But it varies by immigrant generation. So the farther you are from your immigrant family, the less likely you are to be distinct in your views and look more like the general U.S. public among Latinos. But also, interestingly, going the other way, when you take a look at immigrant Latinos who are more recently arrived, they have much stronger views about concerns about the environment, concerns about global climate change, concerns about issues and about environmental degradation in their own communities than immigrants who've been in the United States longer. So among Latino immigrants, there's even a unique story. So the closer somebody is to those roots in Latin America, the stronger is their views about what's happening in their communities on any of the measures that we look at. It's actually pretty consistent across all these different measures. So that's the story that we see across when you've arrived, but also across how far you are from your family's arrival in the United States.
Can I?
Yeah, absolutely.
Can you explain why you think that is? Is it related to that some immigrants are fleeing because of weather-related issues in the agriculture that they worked in back in their home country? Or
It could very well be. And whether or not this was something we would have seen 10 years ago or 20 years ago, that I don't know. So in our most recent surveys, this is a pattern, and those who are coming more recently from Latin America may be bringing those concerns with them. And I think that what's happening with the U.S. born is they're looking more and more like the general U.S. public in many ways, particularly those who are third or higher generation. They're more likely than not to be the children of parents, one of whom is Hispanic, one of whom is not. So their parents have intermarried. That may also be impacting the opinions of those who are U.S. born to look more like the general U.S. public on a number of measures. We even see when it comes to religious affiliation, since we're here talking about religion, you will see, for example, that U.S. born Latinos, particularly those of third generation, are maybe grew up Catholic, but have left and say they're unaffiliated. But they look an awful lot like other young Americans in terms of their religious affiliations and also attitudes about climate change, et cetera. So that unique Latino attentiveness to environmental degradation as an issue kind of fades a little bit as you go into later generations, but it doesn't go away, just that people look more like Americans generally.
A question maybe for Elena and Sylvia, if you've had any experience with this in the communities you've worked with, and then maybe we'll go to Mark after once again to see what the data tells us. Do you notice a difference in the way that Latino communities engage with environmental issues, like direct environmental degradation? There's an incinerator going into their community, or there's pollution affecting their kids, versus kind of the distinct and broader issue of climate change. Is there a difference in the way that these communities relate to that? Maybe we'll start with Elena and then Sylvia, if you've seen that in your reporting.
Yeah, I think what we've seen generally with all our states are that parents are very immediate concern for their children and their family. And then older parents too, like grandparents being really worried, and at that age, not really having the energy, and it feels unfair that they're the ones that have the burden of having to be the organizers and be the ones, because they should be resting, but they're the ones who are very active. And I think as their kids grow up and go to college or go to high school, then they also become advocates more on that climate change, that bigger issue. And so it's kind of like at different levels and a circular thing again.
Yeah, I was kind of going to say the same thing, basically, just anecdotally from what I've seen. I think, too, so much of the Latino population is young, the young population. And so I think as also that cohort of 18 and under gets older, we're going to see that more and more reflected in elections and in the voting booths, because that population is, and you've probably seen it in the actual research.
As you mentioned earlier, an additional 4 million Latinos are eligible to vote this year compared to 2020. Most of that has come from U.S.-born young Latinos coming of age here. About 3 million of that 4 million are young people born here. And when you look at the U.S.-born Latino population, half of it is under the age of 20.
Yeah.
So a lot of change is to come, and a lot of impact is to come, but it really just shows how young this population is. For white Americans, the median age is about 44. For Latinos, overall, it's about 30, but for U.S.-born, it's 20. That really shows you how young this population is.
Well, I want to make sure we get some time for questions from the audience. So if anybody has a question, let's get you. Oh, sorry, there's a microphone coming around. Yeah.
Thank you. This is a question for Mark. I'm Cuban American. I'm wondering.
I'm Mexican American.
Okay. I'm wondering, with the surveys that you did you break it down by different Latino groups? And if so, did Cuban Americans stand out on this issue in particular?
For this work, no, we were unable to do so because the sample sizes aren't sufficient for anything but Mexican Americans. Not to say that we design our surveys to satisfy my family, but the Mexican American population makes up almost 60% of the adult Latino population. Another 10% is Puerto Rican, but then we start to get down to 3%, 4% for some of for the other groups like Cuban or Dominican or Salvadoran, and that already is tough to have a sufficient sample size for these groups, except for maybe some big surveys. I will say most Cuban American adults lean Republican, and that there has been an increase in the share who lean Republican since 2016. So through the Obama years, there was a growing share that were Democrat, still mostly Republican, but the Republican share has gone back up again. And so whether or not that's correlated with attitudes about climate change, as I mentioned earlier, I don't know if it's Cubans who are driving those changes, but Republican Latinos
Don't
are.
hold that against me, please.
And touche. There is probably a link there. But I also want to say that not every Republican Latino is Cuban. And I think there's oftentimes that mistake is made that, it's because Republican Latino, they're just in South Florida. Actually, no, there's a lot of third-generation Mexican Americans who are also very conservative and also Republican-leaning or Republican-identifying. So, sorry I can't answer your question better.
No, that's okay. Thank you.
Any other questions? Christian?
Good evening. My question is, since many of the Hispanic Americans that are living in the United States, as we've talked about, many of them are undocumented and don't have the opportunity to vote and to affect, elections and from a deeper way, policy changes. How does that communication look like inside of the Latino community when it comes to that their children and grandchildren are now voting eligible citizens? And what does that look like? Is there an intergenerational influence on how they vote, or do we see a lot of independence in that? And not just from a research standpoint, but also from a grassroots standpoint. Like, what are the community organizers saying? What are the organizations on the ground saying?
Let's go, maybe Bishop Tyson, if you can speak. I don't know, you mentioned a lot of your diocese is undocumented. Maybe if you have anything to say, and then Elena also, since you're working kind of in the organizing world.
Yeah, well, it's a great question. I mean, we are highly immigrant. Let's put that on the table. And Mark's data is very fascinating. I wish we were better at looking at data and calibrating our response. We do a lot on Radio Cadena, La Voz del Campesino. And so a lot of the community organizing, the participation for people who cannot vote is done through community forum and through radio and social gatherings and, dare I say, pachangas. No, I mean, you just find ways to bring people together to talk about their concerns and listen very carefully. I think, again, that's why in many ways the diocese and our ministry is pretty active and our masses are jammed in Spanish, because the social, the political, the spiritual, the agricultural, the communal, all are on the church and around the pastor, partly because there's no other forum if you're undocumented. And there's, when you walk into a church and you're undocumented and you walk in to a mass that's jammed with other people who are working in the fields, you think to yourself, I'm not alone. We are many. So that's kind of how organizing works on that first generation, and we have people that get on the air for KDNA and people that get in front of other people. There's no political outlet other than that. I mean, there's certainly some processions and we have some big community things, but I hope that it's a great, great question. So thank you for the question. And I hope that just sheds a little light, at least in my part of the world.
Let's go, Mark, quickly, if you have any data, and then let's go to Elena on this as well.
I was going to say that about 8 million Latino adults are undocumented immigrants. So that's on a base of about 46 million or so Latino adults. Gives you some sense of how big that population is. Majority of undocumented immigrants are from Latin America. But I was going to say, one thing I was going to point out is that, I don't know if you know this or not, but Congress, if they voted today, maybe tomorrow, is trying to change a law here in the District of Columbia that allows undocumented immigrants to vote in local elections. We've been talking about the importance of local issues around the environment as being important. So in some places around the country, undocumented immigrants would have a voice in local elections and in local places. Now, that's not uniform across the country, but places like DC are one of the few places in the country where undocumented immigrants can vote in local elections.
Elena?
Yeah, and I wanted to say, I work with Chispa and started about 10 years ago, and the idea maybe at first was like, let's get people who are affected by climate change to hear about this as an environmental issue and vote on it. And then very quickly, people are like, no, that's not the way to approach this. We need to organize, help people organize from the ground up on the issues that affect them and get them more civically engaged. So the idea of civic engagement is way more than just voting. It is a lot of carne asadas. It is also rallies, petitions, and just having the power of the people, that you don't necessarily have to, and I'm not even saying that they can't vote, but what I'm saying is you don't necessarily have to be a voter to have that power and to have your voice heard and to affect change, because people still listen and things still change. So I think that, yes, there's voting, but there's way more that we're trying to bring to the table as far as civic engagement.
Let's get maybe one question. Yeah, Fatima.
Well, thank you so much for coming in and sharing your wisdom with all of us. My question is really, so my dad he was a campesino when he was in El Salvador and then immigrated here. And the backstory is basically when plants die in our home, he is the green thumb in our family. So he's the one that's restoring all of our plants in our family and in our church. And so my question is mainly is there any way in where campesinos or immigrants that are coming from El Salvador or Mexico or from anywhere really, are they giving the space to even share their own wisdom within their communities and within local governments or even in Senate or in Congress? I don't know if you have any information on that or how we can project their voices because they know our earth.
Can I just?
Oh, yeah.
Can I add something to that?
Sure, yeah, sure.
My question is kind of adding to what she asked. So for those immigrants that just got to the country, how or if there is any initiative that we can actually share with them and make them part of the solution instead of adapting to a system that have weakness.
Great.
Thank you.
So we'll start maybe with the first part of the question. And Sylvia, I know you've reported on some communities where a lot of these cultural practices are, or where the population wants to raise up these cultural practices where there's big changes in demographics. You wrote one story about a year ago about Compton where this was prevalent. Maybe you've heard some stories that might address what Fatima had asked first.
Yeah, you're saying like ways to get his skill set, like kind of put it to use in a bigger context than just in your home, basically. Yeah, I mean, I'm not a community organizer, though I've reported on a lot of community organizations. So, I mean, one I think is definitely like finding your people, right? Going to church, going to like community centers where you can kind of start getting involved and find your way in. Though my first reaction when you were talking is, I'm coming from the journalism perspective, like we also need to be telling more Latino stories, right? And stories of the people who come here and are contributing to the country. And a lot of that comes back to also having more representation in newsrooms so that there is that perspective to know to seek out those voices and those people, whether it's regular everyday people that are doing interesting things or have an interesting skill set or starting a new organization, or if it's like Latino scientists or, professors and like all the different ways that our community contributes. I think there is a dearth in media of uplifting and really showing that, like equally reflecting back the contributions.
Elena, maybe we'll go to you, especially on that second question, and then we'll wrap it up after that.
Oh, yeah. I wanted to say that, we always have the jokes, right, that our parents were like the original environmentalists, like they save all the bags, and our dads never turned on the air conditioning. And I do think that giving people voice is really important. Like one of the campaigns they did with Chispa Nevada, where the PUC, the public energy company there, has raised rates like 5 times in a row, and people can't afford their power anymore. And so people like simply Jose, right, said, I have to pick between medicine or food or my electricity bill. And so that power that Jose brought with his story to this big issue brings it home. And so I think it's really important to validate those voices and to have that representation in those real stories. Yeah.
Thanks. Well, so as we wrap it up, let's get one more question to each of you. Just a quick response. What is the most important thing to remember as we think about the connection of Latino communities and environmental justice? And what is the most important thing to do? And let's start again with you, Mark.
Latinos are poised to be leaders in their communities and nationally on environmental issues.
Sylvia?
Oh, man. I think it's important to look in the places that nobody's looking and see that the power of community can really make change in ways that nobody expects.
Elena?
I think seeing people and seeing the obstacles that they have that you may not have and accompanying them with those and listening to their voices on what the solutions they want for their community and lifting up those stories and people.
And Bishop Tyson?
Yeah, if I had to say in one word, it would from Pope Francis be encuentro. I think the two things that need to happen to follow up. One, I think we have to physically go out and pick fruit and clear tables and cook food and be side by side to know what the voice is we're hearing. And second, we have to create safe environments, especially for the undocumented, to be heard in ways that respect their, how do I say this, their status, because they're vulnerable and don't necessarily want to be in front of a television camera or limelight. So to look for those community opportunities to give voice. But it starts with us physically accompanying and walking and working with them in the kitchen, in the field, in the harvest. That's key.
Encounter. Well, thank you. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Sylvia, Elena, and Bishop Tyson. And thank you, all of you, for joining us for this important conversation. Just a reminder, this discussion was recorded, and we'll post it on our website and on our social media channels in the coming days. And we have follow-up resources from this discussion posted there, too, if you want to check those out. We hope you can join us for 2 upcoming dialogues in June. The first is on June 4th at 7 p.m. We'll have a dialogue on Georgetown's main campus to discuss the Civil Rights Act of 1964 after 60 years, challenges and questions for voters in the nation in 2024. We'll have author Jim Wallace, Diane Russ Tierney from Georgetown's Racial Justice Institute, Sister Cora Marie Billings, a trailblazer for racial justice in the Catholic Church, and Kesley Janvier, a Georgetown student who leads the university's NAACP chapter. And then on June 18th at 7 p.m., we'll be joined by author Ta-Nehisi Coates, CNN's Jake Tapper, award-winning journalist Amanda Ripley, Claire John Grave from Religion News Service, and Eric Wemple from The Washington Post to discuss the vocation of a journalist in a time of testing. They'll reflect on lessons that they learned from their mentor and our initiative's founder, John Carr's younger brother, David Carr, who is the late media columnist of the New York Times and encouraged each of these journalists at the beginnings of their careers. So please visit our website for more details on these gatherings. I want to make sure to thank my colleagues, Kim Daniels, John Carr, Kim Mazik, Anna Gordon, and Ana Cuadra, for all of their help putting this together. For those of you who are here with us in person, we can continue the conversation upstairs over food and drink, so make sure to come upstairs for the reception. And then finally, please join me once again in thanking Mark Hugo Lopez, Sylvia Foster Frau, Elena Gauna, and Bishop Tyson and Bishop Evelio.